Damn it, not again. Myron Bannister strode up to the front of the room to rounds of applause, most of it enthusiastic, but some of it very forced. For Frank Tanner, it was definitely forced. It would be bad form not to clap, but goddammit, he did not have to mean it. It was the annual state orchid competition. For the orchid growers like Frank and Myron, this was the big one, the one they worked toward all year long. Frank and Myron were always the two top contenders. Lately, however, Frank had been in a major slump and lost again and again to Myron. That really drove him nuts. They had exchanged first place for a long time, both experts in crossbreeding and creating new and more colorful, amazing examples of orchids. Blues, purples, reds, and more combined to create dazzling arrays of flowers, which baffled the other wannabes and put smiles on the judges' faces. Frank had been champ for so long. Then Myron showed up. They exchanged first-place ribbons for a while, back and forth, until things changed. Until lately. Lately, Myron had been shellacking Frank. Although Frank had his share of first-place ribbons, the big matches, the ones which got in the publications and caused other people who collected the seeds generated from their hybrids to call them for samples, were all going to Myron. Now here they were at the biggest one of the year, and Frank was in second, while Myron got the grand prize. This one carried a money prize, lots of press. Not a single member of the press gave a single shit about who came in second. How does he do it? Frank asked Jane Billmore, who stood next to him smiling and clapping. How does he do this? I don't know, Frank, she said. I wish I did, or I'd be up there accepting the award. Come on, you got second place. That's still a decent prize. Frank frowned. Yeah, but it isn't first. No one likes a sore loser, Jane said. There was little he could say in reply. Instead, his anger burned bright toward Myron as the preening little man smiled, waved, posed for photos, and accepted his check. Behind him, on the table, was his prize-winning orchid, an amazing, impossible thing with strips of red, yellow, green, magenta, and other shades, which made it look like a rainbow you could touch with your hand. It was impossible. Impossible. Later, Frank sat on a stool inside his greenhouse, looking over his crop of orchids. They were beautiful, truly. Stunning colors of all shades and varieties, but none with bizarre strips or the weird shapes like Myron had been producing. Frank was down. I don't know what to do, guys, he said to his plants. I think you're the best around, but the judges keep giving the prizes to Myron. Frank sighed heavily and turned back around, reading another few paragraphs in one of his orchid books. He had hundreds of these books, and when he wasn't tracking down some rare edition, he was looking for tips on growing orchids online. It was his passion, and had been for years now. Things had been grim at first. His wife Marie had not taken kindly to him lying around the house. The accident with the scaffolding left him unable to walk since he fractured both legs and injured his back. He had good insurance, but there was no way he would be able to stand at the lines or do maintenance around the plant anymore. It had been his life other than his house and wife. Without his career, he had nothing and took his feelings of nothingness out on Marie. He didn't physically abuse her, but it mattered little when you were a bitter shit and just yelled at her about everything. To the woman's everlasting credit, she waited until he could stand and get around before leaving him. She left in the middle of the night, leaving behind a note. Frank felt nothing. He had been feeling nothing for some time, and he knew he should have been upset about it. Instead, he shrugged and waddled into the kitchen to grab something to drink. The gateway drug into orchids was his garden in the backyard. Frank's doctor told him he had to get active. He had to find something to get the muscles and bones moving and grooving again, or he'd only get worse and end up in a wheelchair. The thought of trying to navigate a wheelchair around his house was enough of a nightmare to shock him out of his stupor. He knew if he tried to live in the house by himself, his sister or one of his other relatives would tell him it was impossible. He'd end up in a senior community or some other bullshit. Frank Tanner was not going down that way. No, sir. So, Frank found himself at the local gardening center at the home improvement store. He had no clue what to do, and as such, did something else he didn't do often. He asked for help, then left with soil, fertilizer, and lots of flowers, plants, vegetables, and other sundries to help him do the planting. He knelt down, with great difficulty, in his yard and started making his yard fruitful. It was hard work, causing him to sweat, and he was just winging it that first time, but it felt good to work with his hands again. Damn good. He was whistling and smiling by the time he was done. He went back out to the yard the next day, and the next. When the flowers and plants grew, he experienced emotions which surprised him and stood in his backyard weeping for several minutes. Frank was hooked after that moment, a total garden junkie. He visited his library in the off-season. He spent the winter doing his exercises so he could garden with renewed vigor even his doctor noticed. When he wasn't recovering, he was at the library, then doing things in his yard to make sure it was ready for spring. Before long, he was growing roses and other flowers. His yard was alive and bright. Just by accident, while shuffling through the shelves at the library, he came across a book of orchids. The cover and photos were dazzling and captured his imagination. He had to have some. Not long after came the greenhouse. Eventually came the first round of orchids which didn't up and die on him. The feeling of creation and excitement was like the drugs he remembered taking when he was in college. He was hooked like a largemouth bass too deeply for humane catch and release. Frank spent time in his yard for sure. He was proud of the garden, but he spent more and more time in the greenhouse, tinkering. He learned how to cross-pollinate. His first attempts were not great, but he kept at it. Eventually, after months which soon turned into years, he was ready to show off one of his creations. He brought his orchid to a local flower show and entered a competition. He didn't place at all back then, but the other contestants were very encouraging toward him. The attention he got felt good. He was out and about and socializing. He made friends with other orchid growers. They taught him new techniques, and before long, he was placing in local competitions. Then he traveled to other states to place in more competitions. He cut back what he grew in the backyard garden, and his greenhouse overflowed with orchids. Frank created amazing color combinations. His flowers were hardier than others, lasted longer. He sold a few, but more to Frank's liking, he placed higher and higher in the competitions. It became his drug of choice. He had to win. He had to come in first. Frank placed first a year later at a downstate competition. Then he came in first at a gardening show closer to home. Now others were coming to him for advice. Frank felt alive. Then, Myron showed up. The arrogant shit showed up at Frank's local flower show one year, out of nowhere. The man dressed in a bright orange sherbet-colored suit and talked loudly. He bragged about his flowers, which he kept hidden by a tarp. When the time came, he removed the tarp dramatically, and the entire pavilion gasped. So did Frank. Myron's flowers were unlike anything they had seen before. Bright, vibrant colors like something out of a comic book. It wasn't just splotches of color, but swirls and shapes. The orchids were almost hypnotic to look at, like they grabbed you and pulled you in. They dazzled Frank at first, but then he was just a little bit afraid. He got the feeling the flowers wanted his attention. Perhaps more. The flowers were hungry. Frank blinked and shook his head, letting the frustration over such dazzling flowers take over. It was obvious the moment Myron pulled the tarp back who would win. Frank was in second place. That first time, Frank took the loss with a smile. In fact, he even tried to approach Myron to congratulate him. He also hoped to get a few tips about growing orchids as vibrant and amazing as Myron's. However, the arrogant, officious little prick acted like Frank was a dog turd on his shoe. "Congratulations, Myron." Frank said, extending his hand. Myron looked down at the hand, then extended his fingers and brushed Frank's fingertips. "Hello," he said. "I'm Frank Tanner," Frank continued. "I won here last year." "I know who you are. Sorry, but there's a new sheriff in town. I hope you'd like to come in and second today. I feel you'll be doing that a lot in the very near future." Frank blinked as if Myron had slapped him. The man in the bright suit smiled at him, and the grin was just irritating enough Frank balled up his fist. "Well, we shall see," Frank replied, keeping his face and tone neutral. "I'd love to have lunch with you sometime, maybe share a few gardening secrets. I might have techniques you haven't thought of, and I'd love to pick your brain about these gorgeous orchids." Myron's face changed to outright disgust at the thought. "I don't think so. I doubt you have anything of use for me, and why would I want to give you my secrets?" The odious man leaned in closer, and there was an odd coppery smell to him Frank found repellent to such a degree he took a half step back. "I plan on winning and winning and winning," Myron hissed. "I will be famous for these orchids. Soon you'll just be a footnote in this little town's history." With this said, Myron turned his back, gathering up his trophy and orchid, and strode off. Frank stood there, his mouth and eyes twitching. He stood there for a long time, while the pavilion emptied around him. Frank went home raging. On the way, he pounded on his steering wheel and shouted at the radio. When he got into his house, he threw down his coat and stormed out into his greenhouse. All of his orchids shone brightly in the sunlight. They were gorgeous, but at the moment, he hated them. Frank went into a rage, destroyed many of his prized flowers, and tossed them against the wall. When he was done, he collapsed to the floor, exhausted, sweating, and then he cried. He hadn't cried since his wife left, but this felt like a deep wound. Later, he would be embarrassed, but at the time, it felt natural. Frank threw himself into finding different and more obscure ways to grow orchids. He sent away for exotic fertilizers. He found seeds from places around the world. He spent money to bribe other growers to cultivate new species and colors. His passion grew, and the flowers he produced were even more dazzling, but they still didn't match up to the swirls and lines Myron could create. Each time he came up with something new, though, Frank went to the competition and hoped for the best. There were a few where Myron didn't show, and he ended up winning, but they were the smaller shows. It embarrassed Frank to win these, and felt like a coward. He did it for his own ego, but never felt good about it. The local papers stopped showing, asking him questions, or featuring him. Frank threw away his local gardening magazines because Myron's face glared out at him far too often. Last year, Myron and Frank ended up in a statewide competition. Myron's flowers were amazing and dazzling. He won handily. Frank came in second, smiling his false smile and clapping during the awards presentation. Surprisingly, there was a party at a local bar for all of the orchid growers, and Frank found himself sitting next to Myron. Myron wore his bright yellow suit and wide-brimmed hat. Looking like a lemon trying to pass itself off as a pimp, he had been hitting the bottle pretty hard. His round moon face shone a bright red, and he was sweating more than usual. Myron's eyes were bloodshot, and he slurred his words. The booze made Myron more friendly than normal, and he smiled, clapped Frank on the shoulder, and leaned in to talk to him. The smell of alcohol was thick, like a fog around the little man. Frank wanted to lean back, vomit, or run from the bar, perhaps all three. Instead, he leaned into the stink and listened. "I know you want the secret," Myron said, his words slurred together into a sentence barely comprehensible. "I know, but secret is a secret. I can only tell you one part of the secret." Myron swayed from a breeze only he could feel. He leaned back, looked around as if spies lurked in every corner. His paranoia was as much of a wave as the stench, and Frank, for a moment, thought spies might be around too. Then the fat man leaned in again. You think you've suffered 'cause your wife left you," Myron said, and then he laughed a weird, cruel little laugh. If Frank hadn't been so intent on listening, so obsessed with his goddamn orchids, he would have punched the man. "You haven't even begun. You have to do things you wouldn't imagine to create flowers with the beauty I create. You have to bleed for your art, Frank. Lots and lots of blood. Tons of it." The last 3 words he yelled and waved his arm in the air in a dramatic flourish, which caused him to spill most of his booze. Frank stepped back so he didn't get punched in the face. Myron leaned back in. "You need to bleed," Myron repeated, then gave a conspiratorial wink. "The flowers need food, and you have to be willing to do anything to get it." Myron disengaged from Frank's shoulder and staggered off to another part of the bar. It left Frank bewildered and reeking of the man's stench. Frank stood there bewildered for a long time. After a day or so, puzzling over what Myron might have meant, he just gave up. The dickhead had been drunk, and who knew what he meant? Frank decided it was best to leave it as the insane rantings of an insane man who was also drunk. But as Myron kept winning, Frank's mind kept returning to the conversation at the bar. His friends on the Orchid circuit kept telling him he needed to relax. Myron was racking up the wins, but Frank still won from time to time. Myron only showed up at the bigger, showier competitions, so his wins earned him more press. Myron was selling orchids too, and rumor was people from around the world were paying sky-high prices for just one of his flowers. Frank had a few benefactors too, but nothing like what he was hearing out of the Myron rumor mill. Was he being petty? Was he getting caught up and obsessed for no good reason? During the light of day, when he worked happily in his greenhouse, Frank was sure he was being silly. But when the darkness came, as the night came in and he missed his wife, he thought differently. When the night came, he was obsessed with finding out Myron's secret. He conjured plans and ideas to get the secrets, too. He could take Myron out to drink again and see if he could get him drunk and talking. The problem with this plan was ever since they had spoken the one night at the bar, Myron hadn't wanted to talk to him again. Frank wasn't sure he'd be able to convince Myron to go out for another drink. Myron didn't seem to want to talk to him. At the same time Myron was avoiding him, he was continuing to win and win again. The colors of his orchids dazzled everyone. Even though Frank was jealous, and this jealousy was festering within him, the flowers also dazzled and impressed him. "That son of a bitch," he said once when several of the other orchid growers went out after a show. "I can't stand him." "Frank, you have to relax," said his friend Peter. "You put too much stock in this stuff, man. It's not good for your heart." "Don't give me that shit, Peter," Frank replied, swigging from his beer. "You know how much work we put into this. You can't tell me you aren't pissed off by the prissy little bastard." Another grower, a large man named Mark, leaned in. "I can't stand him personally, but you have to admit, his flowers are gorgeous." An older woman named Marge added her own drunken opinion. "His flowers are gorgeous, Frank. I mean, I've tried everything and everything else and still can't come up with colors like Myron. He's some kind of genius." Frank pounded his fist on the table. The rest of the bar got quiet for a moment. "Have they checked him?" he asked. "Do any of you know? Are those real orchids? Is he crossbreeding with other flowers? There's no way to get those colors in an orchid, goddammit." Marge leaned back. "Yes, of course, they always check. It's part of the process. Maybe not at the 2-bit shows where we win sometimes, but the big ones, they do. They have experts who check to make sure the orchids are real and not something else. Myron passes with flying colors." "It's just fucking rude," Frank said, deflated. "We've always shared tips and suggestions with each other. It's part of competing. We're friends, right?" All around the table raised their drinks and agreed. "Well, he doesn't, right?" Frank finished. "Have any of you ever spoken to him and gotten any tips about how to improve your flowers?" "No," Peter said. "He never talks to us. We got him out to the bar one time and he still said nothing." He told me I need to bleed for my flowers, Frank muttered. He was so drunk I don't think he knew what he was saying. He told me my wife leaving wasn't enough to bring about the winds. I hadn't bled enough. What the hell do you think he means? Mark shook his head and shrugged. I've made myself bleed on my flowers. I mean, accidentally. I'm a total klutz with the shears sometimes. He was drunk, Marge said. You can't take anything he said at face value. The conversation drifted to other topics then, but Frank glowered and drank. After the drinks and conversation, Frank threw himself back into his work. He bought soil from other parts of the world. Searching the internet, he found fertilizer from distant lands, plant food from the furthest corner of the planet. He found strange methods of growing orchids from China, Asia, the Middle East. Nothing was too obscure or strange. His results were impressive a few times, but not always. Frank ended up throwing away huge numbers of flowers with hideous colors, but a few came out beautiful. He would bring these to competitions, sure he could beat Myron, but the pompous ass always showed up in a dazzling suit and an even more dazzling flower. Frank's anger grew. Finally, at a show just a few months ago, Frank worked his way through the growing crowds which had showed for Myron's dazzling displays. He got close enough to grab Myron's hand. The little shit looked down at him like Frank was something he'd stepped in. Myron, please, he begged. Later, he would curse himself for breaking in front of the turd man, for begging and weeping and crying. However, at the moment, he saw his wife's face as she left him, and he had to know. Myron, I need to know. Myron, in front of the crowd, pushed Frank's hand away, removed a handkerchief from his pocket, and wiped his palms. The oaf tilted his head back to better look down his nose at Frank, even though Frank was easily a foot taller than Myron. Get away from me, Myron hissed. Don't you ever touch me again. Give it up, Frank. You'll never know, and you'll never win, not as long as I'm around. If I'm in the competition, get used to second. Now, go live your pathetic life and play with your simpleton flowers. I'm sure there's some Peruvian soil compound you haven't tried yet. The man laughed. Myron was dressed in a bright green suit with a fedora, like the Riddler from Batman, and the laugh pierced Frank's heart in a way which surprised him. He hadn't felt this betrayed, this upset, since his wife walked out the door. Myron turned away from Frank, the crowd, the press, and walked away. There was silence for a moment as the press and audience stared, trying to understand or process what they had just seen. Then they hurled questions at Myron and ran after him. It was then Frank decided he had to kill Myron. Well, at first, the idea was he would find out how Myron got his flowers as beautiful as they were. One way or another. He would break into Myron's house and find out how he grew his orchids. Was the thought crazy? Sure it was. However, once the thought got into Frank's skull, there was no stopping it. It rolled around and around like some kind of marble even before he grabbed Myron's hand and begged him. Perhaps the begging was his last-ditch effort to stop himself from doing something he knew crossed from obsessive to criminal. Frank had never broken into a home before. At first, he wasn't even sure where Myron lived. He knew it was likely close to where he lived, since the man showed up to all of the same shows in the same state. Frank kept a close eye on other competitions in other states, and Myron rarely showed, unless it was a city very close to where they lived. It was amazing what you could find online when you became determined and turned your mind to it. When he was determined to find new ways of growing orchids, Frank found all kinds of supposed secrets and tips. When he needed to find Myron's address, it wasn't long before he came across it. It took a little money, but a phone number listing led to the address, and there it was. Myron lived in the next town over, not over 50 miles away, barely an hour, less if Frank drove fast, and he did so. Not long after finding the address, Frank went on Google Maps and looked at the street view of the house. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, In fact, strangely, he didn't even see a greenhouse. This puzzled Frank. How did you grow orchids like the ones Myron did without a greenhouse? Perhaps he had a room inside the house. The house itself wasn't particularly huge. 2 floors, probably a basement judging from the windows near the ground level, perhaps 2 bedrooms. The house appeared all by itself on a main road. Myron had a lot of land, which was trimmed nicely, but he had no outdoor garden. Just the main house and a big barn-type building out back, which looked like a good strong wind could blow down at any moment. Strange, but Myron was eccentric. Frank studied the road. He studied the house as best he could. He found a satellite image to look at the house from the top down. It wasn't well defined, but enough for him to guess there was nothing but a big empty field all around the house. No tall grass or weeds, no crops growing out back. No way to hide either. Was there security? Frank couldn't see anything on the Google Street View because it didn't get close enough for him to get a good view of the house. If he had one of those Ring doorbells, then the front door was out of the question. Security cameras were small enough you could put a bunch in windows peeking out from curtains and then download it to a computer or phone. Myron didn't seem like a technology person, but who knew? Maybe he had a son or a nephew who was. With his prizes, growing pile of prize money, and desire for secrecy about his flowers, there had to be security. Frank felt his first doubts. Would he be able to bypass security? He was hardly a cat burglar and had no clue how to send an electromagnetic pulse to shut down all electrical devices in the house. The doubt did not last, though. No sooner had it entered his brain when he remembered the look on Myron's face as Frank debased himself and begged for help. The look telling Frank he was nothing. The rage came back, and Frank decided he'd rent a car and wear a mask over his face. He would do all he could to conceal himself and his body. Frank assembled his kit. Dark clothes, mask, something to smash open a window, and another device to break open locks if he had to. He bought a lockpick gun online, then practiced using it with his own house. It was loud as hell, but it worked. Then, he bought the gun. When Frank was a child, his father had guns, most of them rifles or shotguns. Frank himself owned a pellet gun when he was a preteen, mostly shooting cans or targets he made. He was too afraid to shoot at animals, despite some of his friends wanting him to and wanting to do so themselves. He never went along with it. Shooting a bird to death just for sport never appealed to him. Despite this, he was a pretty good shot with targets. He was best at a shooting range, aiming at stationary targets way down at the other end. Hardly the same thing as aiming a pistol at Myron and pulling the trigger. Would he be able to do it? He pondered this question while researching which pistol to buy for the task. His search history would be a problem, so he was already planning on tossing his laptop into the deepest lake in the area after he was done with his mission. He settled on a 9mm. When the pistol came, he went to a nearby field, set up cans along a fence line, then made sure it looked like no one was around. He took a few tries to get comfortable with the recoil of the pistol and reacquaint himself with shooting, but before long, he was plinging the cans right off the fence. What did he want to do? This was the next question he had to face. Was his intention to just break in and gun down Myron? He already knew he would gain great satisfaction watching the look of surprise on the little prick's face. He hoped he could hit the bastard in a spot which would be fatal, but not too quick. It surprised Frank to find out he could be this way, but once he admitted it, he embraced it. No, he did not want to just kill Myron. He wanted to destroy the orchids. It wasn't enough to steal the orchids. Everyone would know he had committed the act. He would destroy Myron utterly and completely. Frank hoped he would get inside and find out Myron had somehow cheated, used some unorthodox or outright illegal method of creating his flowers. Perhaps this would be leaked to the press so Frank could ruin Myron's reputation and have his prizes revoked posthumously. The thing which bothered Frank the most was how to get away with it. How could he do this thing and not get caught? The rental would require a credit card so they could trace him. He toyed with the idea of getting a bogus credit card, but it would require searching something called the dark web, and he had no clue how to do so. He also thought about trying to set up a straw person to get a social security number, driver's license, banking history, and a credit card, but calculated it would take him years. He saw the prison movie where a guy did it, but even in the movie it took the guy almost 20 years. Frank did not have this kind of time. Frank just decided he would do as much of this in cash as he could. This gave him a better idea than renting the car. 2 days later, he had purchased a beat-up old car from some kid 2 blocks away. It only took a couple $100. His savings were dwindling because of his obsessions, but Frank didn't care. He had a mission, and money was secondary. Now he had his equipment. He knew where to go. He had a general idea of a plan. Did he have the guts to go through with it? Frank spent a few days pondering this question. He had planned the execution of this murder, but did he have the stones to dump Myron's body in a river? Would the body just disappear, or would someone find it? Would the cops come to his house? Frank had flapped his gums enough about his hatred of the man he had to end up on a suspect list. How would he establish an alibi? Frank had no relatives he visited regularly. His friendships with people were tenuous at best. There was no one else on the Orchid circuit who could vouch for him. He would have to make sure he left no evidence. Could Frank do such a thing? It was too much to think about. During the entire preparation process, Frank had thought it was his destiny. He was destined to murder Myron and burn his vile orchids. Myron and the flowers had represented something truly evil. The rest would take care of itself. If he ended up having to flee the country and start over somewhere else, so be it. He could grow orchids in South America, too. With the decision made, Frank decided to do the deed 3 nights away, on a Friday night. There were no orchid competitions, no shows, no reason for Myron to be away. With plans in place, Frank was able to sleep better than he had in a while. He had intense, vivid dreams of flowers with colors which never existed in the real world. He saw one with his wife, too, where she told him he was doing great work. If he completed his tasks, she said, she might just come back. The day of the crime, he awoke early and made himself a giant breakfast. He devoured it all, smiling the entire time, unaware he was talking to himself. Frank had never felt better than he did that morning. When breakfast was done, he packed food, grabbed his clothing and weapon. He was on the road an hour later. It was early, the sun still bright. He planned to spend the day watching the house, waiting for sundown. It would be a long day. He had to find out what, if anything, Myron did all day. If the annoying man left his house, Frank would use the opportunity to break in and find the orchids. If he could glean information for himself, great. If not, he'd spread the accelerant and wait for Myron. If he could, Frank imagined holding Myron at gunpoint and letting the bastard watch his prized possessions burn. However, he wasn't sure he'd be able to do so. It was a warming thought, though. The miles flew by, and before long, he drove right past the front of Myron's house. Just like the images online. No changes since they took those, apparently. He saw no new cameras installed or floodlights in the backyard. However, the first run was a quick drive past. He drove down the road about 2 miles into a small town, parked on the street, then got himself a hamburger at a small diner. The diner was filled with townspeople, but no one really took notice of him. After he had finished, Frank drove past again, this time a bit slower. Down the road the other way, he found a place to turn left. It was a short gravel road, the purpose of which Frank could not discern. There were tall bushes and trees on both sides of the opening, making it nearly invisible to traffic, which explained how he missed it the first time. The beat-up old vehicle he drove was mostly black, and he pulled far into the shadows, but could still see Myron's house through the branches of the bushes and trees. Frank had an old pair of binoculars in a case next to him. He pulled them out and focused on the house. Nothing out of the ordinary. He did a quick scan, looking for weak points or more cameras. There was nothing he could see from here, nothing attached to the front door. No camera peeked from the shades covering the windows along the side. He moved lower, scanning the windows which led into the basement. There were no blinds here. Frank sat forward and focused the binoculars. Were those vines in the basement? Lights, much brighter than one would think would normally be in a basement, also seemed to hang from the ceiling. Was this where Myron did his gardening? A basement? This was not entirely out of the ordinary. Others had grown flowers in basements with ultraviolet lights and methods of controlling the temperature. Frank just couldn't remember a single orchid grower he knew who did such a thing. To get the right colors and create the masterpieces the competitors did, most growers used greenhouses or rooms with lots of light built onto their main houses. So this wasn't exactly strange, but it was strange enough. It also sort of explained why Myron always looked so pale in his bright-colored suits. He spent his time out of the sun. So this was where the goods were. Okay, this would be a good place for him to enter the house. Break into or just break one of the windows and slide down into the basement. He might get lucky and Myron would be out, so he could spend a little time with the orchids, gain some secrets. The hours ticked by, and Frank did his best to stay awake, but it wasn't easy. He nodded off once, then snapped awake when a truck barreled down the road in front of his car. When he did so, he grabbed his binoculars and held them up to his face. Just then, the front door opened. It took a moment for Frank to realize the man who emerged was Myron. The man was nearly bald, save for wisps of white hair on the sides, which blew in the wind. He wore no hat. His skin was pale, and he wore a white t-shirt which extended down below his waist, and blue jeans. Simple dark sneakers adorned his feet. This was so unlike the Myron Frank knew, it nearly struck him into immobility. He had to laugh at himself for not realizing Myron would not always wear brightly colored suits and hats in his daily life. Myron walked down the front porch and around the side of the house, vanishing into a small garage a moment later. Eventually, a pickup truck backed out of the garage with Myron behind the wheel, wearing large, dark sunglasses. He signaled a turn right, and a moment later, drove right past Frank's car. Frank had a moment of panic and ducked down behind the steering wheel. It was a little too obvious, and he cursed himself for his slow reaction time. Frank waited for 5 more minutes to make sure Myron was really gone and would not head right back to the house. He started his car, his heart nearly stopping in his chest when the vehicle refused to start at first. Then he quickly turned right and barreled down the road. He pulled into the driveway, the hairs on the back of his neck standing as he drove past the house. He knew he had just seen Myron leave, but he felt certain something or someone watched him. Regardless, he pulled past the house into the backyard, past the rundown barn or garage, then around back of that building. Frank was hidden from the highway now, and he got out of the car. The sound of traffic was so loud he froze for a moment. Then he pulled on his blank white mask and put a black watch cap on his head. It was late enough the sun was going down, but not nearly as dark as he hoped. He could not pass up this chance with Myron out, however. Maybe, he thought, just maybe I can set this fucking house on fire and burn it all down without killing Myron. Maybe this would be enough. He didn't buy it for a minute, but it was enough to make him feel like less of a monster. Frank walked behind the house, trying to keep the building between him and the highway. There wasn't a lot of traffic, but it seemed as if each passing car or truck was 1,000 times louder than it had to have really been. Frank sauntered across the lawn, trying hard not to leave footprints in the grass. The entire time, he focused on the small windows along the foundation. There were a couple in the house's back, too, and this was good. He just hoped one allowed him to access the basement so he could reach the orchids. Were there cameras? Frank did his best to look into the windows, the back door, and around the garage to see if there was any surveillance. There were no overt security cameras. However, he knew these days the cameras were so small they could become part of a doorbell. They were small enough to be worn. There could be one in the corner of a window, or hiding under the eaves of the garage or roof, and he wouldn't see it. Even finding security cameras in a department store these days was hard to do. If Myron had a personal security system, then he'd likely get an alert on his phone. He'd be able to sit at the diner or a friend's house or wherever the hell he was and watch it all on video from his phone. Thus, it was too late now. If the cops came, Frank would just have to run. He'd even leave the beat-up car if he had to. He'd done his best to wipe down the car before he got out. Frank had decided a while ago if he got caught breaking in, he'd go to jail. Myron would still be shocked, and Frank might get the chance to burn down the house or destroy his prized orchids. It would be enough to keep him warm in prison for the rest of his life. Frank reached the back of the house and knelt down. The window was thick, but he reached into his bag and pulled out a plastic device with a metal point on one end and hard rubber on the other. The device was supposed to help someone trapped in a car smash open their windows from the inside. Frank figured it would work just fine for him trying to get into someplace, too. Frank swung and hit the window near the lower right corner. There was a loud smack and the glass cracked. He smiled, then swung again. This time, the pane of glass shattered and fell inward. Frank used the other end of the hammer to clear away the jagged shards of glass still stuck in the frame for a moment. Frank leaned down and stuck his head inside. Just below him was a utility area with a furnace and what appeared to be the hot water heater. Dark, but mostly empty. Perfect. Frank tossed his bag of tools down first. Then he stuck his feet through the window and lowered himself down nearly silently. The darkness overwhelmed him for a moment, and he let his eyes adjust. The room was small, closed off at one end by a simple curtain. As soon as his eyes adjusted, looked around the room, gained the lay of the land, the odd smells hit him. One after another came into his nose. First, there was the very strong smell of minerals and earth. Beneath the scent was the smell Frank knew all too well, the smell of plants. It was the same smell as his greenhouse. Then, as he stood there in the darkness and gloom sniffing, was another smell. Odd. In Frank's greenhouse, there were sometimes plants which died or vegetation which needed removal. Like a good green environmental person, Frank composted. The smell was sort of like that, but not quite. It was stronger. Then there yet another smell beneath. Something very odd. Coppery. Frank frowned. There was something familiar about the scent, but he couldn't place it. Copper pipes, maybe? Some kind of watering or filtration system he had rigged for his orchids using copper pipes? A chill ran up and down Frank's spine. Something inside of him told him to turn around, leave, get out of here. Just go back to his second place finishes with the orchids and be happy. What was wrong with second place? No, he thought. I came this far. Frank pushed the curtain aside and looked into the main room of the basement. He gasped. There were pipes. There was also a large tank at one end. Steam rose off the top of this tank. It was very cold in here. Odd, most orchids required heat, humidity. Not this. Frank shivered. The room was the entire width and length of the house above. Cement walls. Overhead were metal vents for the central air. Rows and rows of tables filled with tools and bags of seed and fertilizer. However, they looked unused and unopened. Gardening tools littered more tables. In one corner was a table of old abandoned flower pots, the skeletal remains of some old flowers, too. Forgotten. The other thing which stood out was the vines. Vines sprawled across the walls, up and into the beams of the ceiling. The vines were vibrant and thriving, creating much of the vegetation smell. Most of them were green, but underneath the green leaves was a dark purple. As Frank watched, the vines seemed almost to pulsate and move like they were breathing, or reaching. At the far end of the room was a door leading into another room. This room seemed added on, pushed beneath the front lawn, perhaps for storage? Maybe this was the original intent, but pipes and electrical cords ran from this main room into this anteroom. This was where the orchids were. Frank knew it. Frank moved his way across the room, the cement floor strangely muted and covered with dirt. This diminished the sound of his footfalls. As he got closer to the door at the far end of the room, the odd coppery smell filtered into his nose. The smell was so strong now it coated his throat. "Is it coming from this tank?" Frank whispered. The tank filled one entire corner, just off to the left of the door into the anteroom. Aluminum? Frank wasn't sure, but he thought so. He was more into plants than metallurgy. Beneath it was some kind of heating unit, making the lid at the top steam. Frank could feel the heat coming off of it. What could this be? Some strange sort of plant food? Fertilizer? Frank leaned forward and rapped on the side of the tank. Whatever the tank was for, it was full, very full. As he leaned closer, he could hear something bubbling and gurgling within. The metal was hot, too. Frank squatted down and looked beneath at the heater. It looked as if Myron had cobbled together this device from spare parts. Something dripped from a nearly invisible seam in the tank's metal. Drip, drip, into a small puddle beneath. A red puddle. Frank reached out and touched the fluid. It was wet. He held it up to his nose and sniffed. Copper. "Jesus," he whispered. It was blood. Frank got to his feet fast, nearly staggered back and over the table behind him. Jesus, he needed to get out of here. No, he needed to see what was in the tank. What was in the tank and what was in the room? Was he crazy? No, he needed to get out of here. Frank approached the tank again, this time reaching out toward the lid. He gripped the edge and lifted it slowly. The stench nearly overwhelmed him, but he leaned forward, trying to breathe through his mouth. When he looked inside, he nearly threw right up into the ooze within. It was filled with some kind of sludge, black and red with bits of white floating near the top. It was the worst thing Frank had ever seen. What was it? Off to the right, hanging on the edge of the tank rim, was a ladle, long with a huge bowl at the end. Frank grabbed it and lowered it onto the ooze. With his stomach roiling and churning, he stirred the vile substance. The black and red colors swirled. More bits of foamy white rose to the surface. Then bits of white powder, or fragments. Frank reached deeper into the tank and swirled again, but now, the ladle struck something down deep. He forced it, and the object bubbled to the surface. When the skull broke through the surface ooze at the top, it grinned at him. There was still flesh stuck to it, bits of hair. The eyeless sockets stared right into Frank's own eyes. Frank gasped and let go of the ladle, where it sank into the ooze and vanished along with the skull. "Oh my God," Frank whispered as he backed away. Frank looked up at the ceiling, the pipes overhead leading into the anteroom. What the holy fuck? Frank felt his heart hammer in his throat as he reached for the handle of the large metal door covering the anteroom. He pulled. The door protested, groaned. It was heavy. What the hell was in here? Why have this kind of door? Eventually, with a metallic squeal, the door opened. Inside was darkness for a moment, and the intense stench of soil and blood. Frank stepped inside, feeling nothing but dread. Then lights came on. Bright, blinding lights overhead. Frank gasped. The copper pipes crisscrossed the ceiling. There were tiny holes in them, and as Frank watched, a pump kicked on. A fine spray spread from the pipes, and even from the distance he was from the spray, Frank could see it was blood. Frank's eyes cast down, and he saw the plants. His mouth opened, and he felt a scream build from within. However, what he saw was so unbelievable, so horrific, he couldn't emit the scream. There were the orchids. Dozens and dozens, in colors unlike anyone had ever created before. Some of them so bright they appeared to glow. However, each of them, the moment the blood spray hit them, all of the flowers lifted their petals toward the ceiling. The movement was so intense and quick, it was as if they were animals reaching out for meat or food. Now, to Frank, the petals at the front looked like tiny faces, small mouths moving and puckering as if trying to drink in the blood spray. The droplets fell, coating the orchids with red for a moment. Then the droplets vanished, absorbed into the plants. All around Frank were vines. Vines snaked from the pots which held the orchids, down across the floor and up the walls. More of the vines with green on top and purple beneath, and now the leaves also reached for the blood. Orchids did not have vines. These were not actually orchids. The thought hammered home into Frank's brain the moment he saw them feeding. These weren't even really flowers. These were creatures of some sort, just resembling orchids. Without even realizing he was doing so, Frank stepped into the room. He wanted to see them up close, had to touch the face of one of these creatures. He reached out for the nearest one, a brilliant blue with purple accents, and touched the face of the thing. It closed around his finger. Pain shot up through his arm, and Frank pulled his finger back. Blood dripped from the end. The orchid made odd sucking sounds, slurping up the blood from the finger and the drops which had fallen when Frank pulled away. Horrified and in pain, Frank backed away, only to bump into the table behind him. As he did so, the plants on this table all turned, leaning toward him, their petals reaching. The vines on the wall moved. Several splayed across the floor also moved, and Frank dodged out of the way as they tried to snag his feet. Aren't they beautiful? Frank spun around to stare back out the door into the basement. There was Myron, still in his jeans and t-shirt. The round man had a blissful smile on his face and descended the stairs slowly. Myron, Jesus, what's going on here? I could ask you the same thing, Frank, but I know why you're here. Did you think I didn't see you ducking down in the car down the road? Cute, but you're definitely no spy. I wanted you to see. Frank stepped backwards, and immediately he felt several of the orchids brush against his hand. More pain flared, and he yanked it away. Blood dripped from tiny wounds. He felt vines wrap around his ankles. What is this? Frank asked. He was beyond trying to justify his reason for being here. He had forgotten about his gun or the kit he had brought with him. Myron, what have you done? Myron moved forward toward the door, and Frank realized the little man wasn't even walking along the cement floor. The vines from the walls had come down, lifted him up off the floor, and carried him forward. Myron appeared to float over the cement floor like some magician doing the world's most amazing trick. As he got closer, Frank could see Myron's eyes. They were shot through with red which pulsated and made his eyeballs bulge from their sockets. They came to me, Frank, Myron said, his voice mild and amused. They're from someplace else. I found the first one in the front yard. Can you believe it? I touched it, and it infected me. I have them up here, in my head. Myron touched his temple. his arm moving slowly as if in a dream. The red lines in his eyes bulged and pulsated as if happy he were talking about them. "They told me they would bring me many things, Frank," Myron said. "I was such a sad, lonely man before I met my friends. Now they're always with me. They're beautiful, aren't they?" Myron stopped his odd floating directly in front of the doorway to the room in which Frank stood. Somehow, the little man seemed much bigger than he really was. It took a moment for Frank's eyes to digest what he was looking at, but he realized the vines in the other room were all around Myron, filling in the spaces of doorway. "They have a special diet, Frank," Myron said and laughed. "Fortunately, there are plenty of places a person can go to find the food they need." "Myron," Frank said as the plants behind them shifted with a weird slithering sound. "What have you done? Are you feeding them blood?" Myron nodded slowly. "Blood and other things. Special food, Frank. You have to bleed to get the kind of flowers you really dream of. Look how they grow. I just have to think of a color and those colors grow. They keep producing as long as I keep feeding them." "Myron, please just let me go," Frank said. Myron was beyond help. All Frank wanted to do was get out of this nightmare. "Please just let me go. I can leave, drop out of the competitions, leave the state." Frank looked around and realized the vines closed in around him from all sides. Myron's smile was still plastered across his face. He looked drunk. The orchids all faced Frank, leaned forward. The petals of each flower moved and twitched. "They're thirsty, hungry." "Myron, just let me out," Frank said. "Just let me out of here. Let me go back to the car and get out of here. Just drive off." Myron nodded as if listening, but he continued to nod, making soft noises long after Frank stopped talking, as if another voice spoke to him. Myron swayed as if there were a breeze. After 30 seconds, which seemed more like a month, he nodded again. "I don't think so," Myron said. "They said not to. They said they're hungry and wanted to try something a bit fresh." The smile which crossed Myron's face was horrific. The vines behind him filled the door. Some of them grabbed his legs and lifted him. They pulled the little man back from the door, then filled the hole in the doorframe where he had been. Frank heard Myron laugh. "You wanted to know the secrets, Frank," Myron shouted. "Well, now you can find out what they are. You know all the secrets I have. They'll show you as they devour you, Frank." Frank tried to make a run for it. He found his ankles bound and fell face first to the floor. As he did, he heard the loud squeal of metal. Frank raised his eyes just enough to see the vines pulling the metal door shut, slamming it. As soon as the door shut, the lights overhead went out. Total darkness enveloped him. "For the love of God, Myron!" Frank screamed as the flowers moved. He heard the slithering sounds of vines and felt them wrap around his wrists, arms, chest, the sound of the tables holding the orchids moving closer. "Yes, Frank," Myron said with a laugh. "For the love of God, for the love of God, for the love of God, for the love of God." Myron let out a long, piercing scream which lasted for far longer than any scream from a human should have. Then it descended into an utterly insane laugh. Something pierced Frank's right arm. 1,000 tiny needles dug into his skin. He opened his mouth to scream, but as soon as he did so, the vines snaked across his teeth and tongue. Then they were down his throat. He felt them digging into his ankles and legs. He couldn't breathe. Frank cried and he tried to scream. He just wanted to grow orchids. He just wanted to grow flowers. As the vines tore out his tongue, then dug into his chest, he saw red behind his eyes, and he tried again to scream. The flowers wouldn't let him. They made him bleed. Then there was black. Poor Frank. A man so obsessed with one thing, he lost sight of what was important. Then he lost sight, period. Take this as some gardening tips for growing flowers when the night comes out. You've been listening to When the Night Comes Out, a weekly horror anthology podcast with stories by Brian W. Alaspa and narrated by Allie James. For Brian's work, visit his website at www.brianwalaspa.com or visit amazon.com for his books of fiction and nonfiction. Be sure to listen to Allie's work on Facebook at Allie James Projects.